I'm Chris Jojo. I'm a senior sound designer at Codemasters Southam Studios, and I'm also the principal sound recording engineer. Based at Southam, we have two teams developing the Grid series and currently the Dirt Rally sequel, which is scheduled to drop sometime in February next year. Codemasters was founded by the Darling brothers back in the 1980s, who basically managed to develop a series of titles that gained a lot of popularity in the marketplace and established themselves as award-winning developers of motorsports titles, adventure games. They were subsequently bought out, but the Codemasters brand was retained and still continues. But now it's more commonly associated with motorsports titles and motorsports racing simulations. The three games in the canon are the official Formula One title, the Grid racing series, and the Dirt series, which is splintered into two titles now, which is Dirt and the Dirt Rally series. The Dirt Rally is more of a hardcore rally simulation. I've been working in the games industry since '92. Over the years, I'd worked for a few British-based publishers, and at a juncture in the early 2000s, I started freelancing. I was working on both game audio and writing and producing music for TV and commercials. I had a colleague, essentially, who was working at Codemasters, who was basically offering me some freelance work, because I had a working experience with him in the past, and that kind of spilled over, I think, over time. He was trying to sort of coerce me into committing to come back and work in a studio environment full-time, which I did in 2008. But prior to that, I'd done some freelance work on some of Codemasters titles. And then I came on board in 2009 to work on Dirt 3. And I've been here ever since. I was involved in a lot of bands, and I was working in Hong Kong for a post-production house. And one of my friends happened to be working in the QA department for an emerging game software developer based in Manchester. And I was working on contract, and he asked me if I would be interested in writing music and doing art and illustration for what was then the early, the nascent sort of 8-bit console, so that the early sort of Nintendo and Sega consoles. I came back from Hong Kong just to have a little bit of a breather, and I took him up on his offer and basically chilled out there, on placement, and met some of the in-house musicians and did a little bit of work, and they offered me a job to write, and program music and sound for the games that were, that they were developing at that point. They were also, shortly after, became part of the Nintendo Dream Team, a very exclusive and limited number of developers that basically were allowed to develop exclusively for Nintendo. We had some very talented programmers there who hacked into the compression codec for the SNES, so they managed to create their own dev tools, and Nintendo got wind of that, and we became part of that clique of developers. And so I cut my teeth on very, very early kind of sample-driven and sound chip-driven, 8-bit, 16-bit console stuff. And back in the day, you basically had to kind of crank out the music, sound design, speech, whatever it was, with a paucity of memory. You could load banks, but over the years, going back from the 90s to where we are now, it's staggering how things have evolved and where we are now, and how the development cycle back then could have been, 6 months or even less. Now we're looking at a year to 2 years, depending on the size and the scope of the game, and where it may have been a handful of sound designers, we're looking at a phalanx of sound designers and people specializing in technical integration, creative sound design, people that are leads, who are the architects of the audio for the game, and have to do all that point-to-point sort of interfacing with the various departments to keep everyone on point and manage what everyone's doing. Yeah, it's quite impressive how far things have come. The area that we're involved with lends itself more to, because it's firmly rooted in reality, obviously being sim-based. So we're kind of charged with trying to convey that element of realism using the most authentic assets that we can source, and trying to create assets that we can obviously implement into the build that are as realistic and as dynamic as possible. Within the audio department at Codemasters, we obviously have teams that are assigned to the project. Some members of the audio department are working on projects that are in development currently, such as myself and Dave Sullivan, because we're involved primarily with the engines. I deal with a lot of recording, capturing assets that are going to be useful to us, or anything specific that we need. And my colleague, David Sullivan, is responsible essentially for building the engine audio. We have an F1 team as well, who work exclusively on that. But the idea is that amongst the designers, we'll have people who've established, the senior level will have experience, maybe some junior level designers, and they're charged. They have a remit of work, and maybe they're dealing with a specific set of audio systems. So someone might be focusing purely on ambience or spot ambient effects, or the UI or the HUD or adaptive music, or we have Ollie Johnson, who's completely focused on speech. So across all of those areas of focus, they're responsible for creating those assets, integrating those assets, liaising with the audio leads. They're the grand architects of each of those projects. So they oversee what everyone's doing. They keep their hands on the tiller insofar as all the systems are working, and obviously working closely with design, production, staying on track with scheduling. So it's a position of very high responsibility and quite a high pressure role, which is not to detract from the other work that people are doing, but they're essentially keeping their hand on the tiller while we're just cracking on. So the idea is to impart, content that that's desirable for the end user, but also to ensure we're engaging with the market, we're increasing the longevity of the actual product itself, but also we're kind of fostering a sense of community around that project, that product itself. So we have RaceNet and community. So there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of events, a lot of content to involve the market, and our players and our core, so that we're giving them value for money. But also it gives us some breathing space, to hit those targets, because there's a lot of licensed content vehicle-wise. There are a lot of sponsors. Licensing takes a long time. There are a lot of cars that are, say for grid, we're covering a whole spectrum of racing disciplines, an amazing roster of landmark, kind of iconic historic cars, contemporary cars, trying to secure access to record those cars and represent them authentically, and to get all of the assets that we've recorded, whatever it is that that's relates to that car. We have a lot of drivers and motorsports enthusiasts who play a lot of Codemasters titles, so you've got to make sure what you're doing is authentic as possible. So recently I've been working on Dirt Rally 2, and also I've been involved in another title that's being developed concurrently with that. That's going to be released at some juncture in 2019. The nature of both of those titles necessitates me being focused primarily on sourcing the cars and recording the cars, because of the sheer size of the content. And what I'm trying to do around that, which I haven't really had to deal with so much in the past, is just to slot in my work, my sprint work, and the sound design work I'm doing, which is tricky, which is why our audio team is kind of expanding now, because this is the first instance where we've developed two AAA titles at the same time. There's a kind of pooling of our audio department staff in some instances. Say one designer can kill two birds with one stone, or share assets across another project, or is doing a recording, say, for one thing. We might be able to share those assets with another project. So it's very fluid, shall we say. People are locked into working, to complete their milestone targets, but also we have people who tend to chip in as well when things start to get pretty hectic. Crunching is obviously something that we're focused on, towards the tail end of the development cycle. That's when things start to hot up. It's taxing, but we love what we do, so we generally hit our marks on time.